We are Teachers College, the first and biggest school of education in the nation. Here, in a single square block in the heart of New York City, we have invented and reinvented the modern K-12 classroom and the community school. We've launched and reshaped so many fields of inquiry in education, health, psychology, policy, and leadership. And today, we're shaping the future in racial literacy, education in human sexuality, nutrition policy, community health, global mental health, and emotional and psychological resilience. From generation to generation, our faculty, students, and graduates have tackled society's most pressing challenges and improved the lives of the people and communities we've served. Think of us as an incubator and accelerator for creating a better world. So tune in to Teachers College, the premier address for informed conversations about how to create a healthier, better educated, more equitable, and more just world. No matter where you are, you're right in our neighborhood.
Good evening, everyone. I'm Dr. Ben Lovett, an Associate Professor of Psychology and Education here at Teachers College. I teach in our school psychology program. Thank you for joining us this evening. As all of you know, the COVID-19 pandemic has had all kinds of problematic consequences, and children are experiencing some of the most significant challenges. Those challenges certainly include maintaining progress in learning and academic skills, but many of us are even more concerned about the social and emotional health of children and adolescents during the pandemic. We developed this panel to get the take of experts at Teachers College on this important topic, and I'm very pleased to introduce our panel now. We have with us Dr. Lottie Jeromey, who is a professor of psychology and education here at Teachers College, Dr. Prerna Arara, an assistant professor of psychology and education here at Teachers College, and Ms. Sarah Feeney, a counselor at Teachers College Community School. And I'm going to ask each of them to talk a little bit more about their background and expertise. Dr. Jeromey?
Hi, everyone. My name is Lottie Jeromey. I'm a professor of psychology and education in the Department of Health and Behavior Studies at TC, where I'm also the director of the programs in intellectual disabilities and autism. So my research focuses on the social emotional well-being of children and families with complex support needs. I examine varied high-need contexts, including the needs of children with developmental disabilities, as well as varied challenged parenting contexts. For example, adolescent parents, parents of children with special needs, and parents facing sociodemographic risks. So in particular, my research emphasizes children's development of self-regulation, which captures their ability to modulate their affective and behavioral responses to challenging contexts like this pandemic that they're experiencing. Another aspect of my work has focused on the needs of parents or other caregivers, as well as the broader family context, as they foster children's social and emotional development. I'm happy to be here.
No, thanks very much. Dr. Arara.
Good evening, everybody. I am assistant professor in the Department of Health and Behavioral Sciences and in the program of school psychology. So I am a school psychologist by training. My particular research areas focus on how to increase access to quality mental health services for particularly underserved youth and adolescents. I have a specific focus on integrating mental health services in schools with again, a focus on depression interventions for children within schools. Some of my past studies have looked at how to decrease barriers to help seeking among ethnic minority and immigrant origin youth and families in schools, and developing and implementing culturally informed school and community-based prevention and intervention programming for youth depression. In my past clinical work, I've worked in many settings, including schools, clinical outpatient mental health settings, hospitals, psychiatric inpatient clinics, and also in primary care settings addressing these and other types of disorders. I have a clinical interest in working with teenagers, with youth, with depression, and anxiety disorders. I'm also thrilled to be here.
Well, thank you very much. And Ms. Feeney.
Hi, everyone. My name is Sarah Feeney. I'm a social worker by training, yet serve as a school counselor at Teachers College Community School. We are a pre-K to 8th grade school that during this time have students both in the hybrid and fully remote model. In a typical year, my main responsibilities include mandated individual and group counseling for students with IEPs, social emotional learning development and facilitation for middle school students, and school-wide social emotion support ranging from crisis intervention, family support, and community building events. Throughout the pandemic, my role has adjusted to meet the changing needs of students and families, as well as the protocols created by the New York City Department of Education. This means that I'm out there during arrivals and dismissals, doing temperature checks, providing technical support to students, and regularly problem solving with students and families around learning at home.
Thank you very much. And thanks again for the audience. My understanding is that you can pose questions at any point. We're going to start with a panel discussion. I have a few initial questions to ask the panelists one by one, and then we'll go into opening things up to the panel. Then we'll have a Q&A session where we'll address your questions from the audience. So I'll start actually with a few questions about setting the context, talking a little bit about what's going on right now. And I'm actually going to open with a question from Ms. Feeney about what counseling services look like right now, how they've changed both at your school and anything else that you might speak to.
Sure. So for counseling, when in a typical year, right, it's face-to-face in person with students in an individual and group manner. And as I mentioned, we also have social emotional learning classes for our middle school students. But what has really changed, obviously, is a lot of it has become remote. And for me and the students, it's something that we're brand new to. So that has really changed the way that we provide services to our students. And considering how providing that counseling in home can change the therapeutic relationship. For example, one thing I did right away is to make sure that all of my students that had counseling had access to headphones, to, even though they're at home, create some kind of privacy that allows them to know that even though that they're at home, maybe sitting in a living room or, you know, in the kitchen nearby to their family members, so that they still have that opportunity to create some kind of safe space. But at the same time, it's created some challenges, especially working with the younger students. There's a lot of things that happen in play and that it's hard to see over the screen or to read a student's body language or even to physically be in the school space is very different. You know, I'm used to kids banging down my door to try to come in and talk to me, or, you know, those wanderers away from class when they need to find another place to really place their emotions and feelings. So being outside of that school space has been very different. But beyond the actual modality of counseling, the other thing that I've noticed too is that my work has really extended much beyond the students that have IEPs that receive mandated counseling, which is typical for a school year. But I think this year more than ever, students are experiencing different emotions and feelings that they haven't been used to, and really understanding how to self-regulate during a time that is very difficult for them to be inside, to have lack of the social connection, and also just having that more solitude and sometimes loneliness, especially I notice in our middle schoolers, to really be able to check in and with all students, not just those ones that have that mandated counseling. And beyond that, we're also very involved with families this year. Because learning is at home, we're working a lot with parents and families around how to create structures at home that facilitate learning and also to really support the social emotional health of their children.
No, thanks for all of that. I mean, I honestly, you know, it's great to hear about the ways that we're addressing some of those challenges. Like, for instance, people might not have thought of the privacy challenges when counseling or therapy is taking place that need to be addressed when things are being done remotely. So absolutely. For Dr. Jeromey, I have a sort of question for you, given your background about how these sorts of issues and the challenges of the pandemic may affect the emotional health, mental health of children with disabilities in a way that's somewhat different, or how it might change over the course of development.
Yeah, so, you know, I think the COVID experience has, for children with developmental disabilities, been quite varied. You know, early in the process, some children were exposed to their learning via technology. Others for whom it would have been very challenging to sort of implement a remote type of setting. Might have had, experiences with teachers providing them worksheets to work on at home with their parents. During this past academic year, many students with developmental disabilities have actually gone back to in-person learning, right, in very small classrooms, in specific types of contexts. So the experiences of those students have been very varied, and some of the early data that we have from research that's out there on their adjustment to this process has also been mixed in terms of those findings. The context of special ed, as with general education, for this population of students, social emotional skills and well-being are very highly infused with their students' outcomes. And many times, the social emotional developmental domains are the outcomes that we are targeting and really emphasizing for those students. That is the part of the students' goals on their IEP or with their teachers. And in so many ways, that process has changed with COVID. Parent-school communication or connections have become even more salient, I think, for this population of students. And sort of, the role that teachers have had to sort of negotiate with parents has changed. So, for example, in early education, many teachers heavily rely on parents to facilitate that remote learning if it's going to occur with their student with special needs. In later development, students' other self-regulatory challenges might have a large impact on their ability to sort of connect with remote learning. And so, the varied context of special education make this a much more complex, I think, situation for that population.
So it sounds like we have a group of students who already are quite variable. Students with developmental disabilities is a pretty heterogeneous group, but It sounds as though the challenges of the pandemic and variability in terms of what sorts of services students are actually receiving will lead to even greater gaps among contributions. So, and I think that's a good segue actually to a question for Dr. Arara. What do you sort of see happening now in a larger societal context, the other sorts of stressors that some students are under more than others that might affect these outcomes?
That's a great question, and I think that does build quite well on what Dr. Jeromey was just saying. So I think one thing we've seen is across the board, there's higher rates of mental health concerns. There's higher rates of depression, anxiety, unfortunately suicidality. But as Dr. Lovett, you're referring to, that these particular concerns have been heightened among certain groups of individuals. So what we're seeing, unfortunately, is that some particular individuals, namely individuals who have higher levels of neighborhood-related stress or socioeconomic stress, poverty, things that might impact their access to food or internet, which school was one of the many ways that they were able to access those services, are suffering more. We also know, and that's been kind of communicated in the media and across by many people, is an additional layer of racial and ethnic disparities that have occurred beyond some of the basic concerns we're seeing again across all children. So we're seeing heightened levels of these mental health concerns, again, because of the lack of services, accessibility of these services, and compounding areas of stress among low poverty, or people living in poverty, high stressors, and racial and ethnic individuals that are again heightened by COVID, but also because of other concerns that are happening in our community.
No, thank you. It really seems as though one thing that many people may not have considered is how much schools do other than delivering academic instruction. When you mentioned, for instance, having internet services at school but not at home, and other sorts of things, not to mention food in terms of school lunch programs and things like that. So it really takes away some of the factors that can equalize outcomes once the school is no longer in the picture in the same way. So thank you very much for that. I'm going to transition to another sort of topic where I'll pose some questions to the panel generally. So now that we're about halfway through the school year, what are the sorts of potential effects? I know some students will experience these more than others of remote learning on students. I know it's a very broad question, but it's something that you can sort of pick and choose what sorts of things you think are most salient.
So I think, if I may begin, one of the concerns that we are seeing because of remote learning that has an impact on so many of the areas that were just described is a lack of connection with others. Is that kind of, as Sarah was just saying, the people that were knocking on the door, the informal conversations, the social support that's gained by that exposure to in-person interaction, we're getting less of that from Zoom. We're getting more structured activities, fewer informal conversations. And even people talking about things like Zoom burnout from that. So we're getting less of the benefits to being to interpersonally engage in the context of schools, and more of some of these challenges that occur with more remote learning, such as being kind of lonely, or being without those areas, those areas of support that we get from the variety of people in schools, our peers, our teachers, and other mental health professionals and other administrators that are there to kind of support the student across their day.
Something that I've seen with our students in our school is, the idea of what learning in school means. And I think when you remove the emotional energy of a school and, what we sometimes label as the joy, it's very difficult for kids to connect with their academic learning. When you are seeing Google Classrooms and math problems, and you're not seeing your teacher's face, or you're not working with your friends side by side, or even one of my students has said, we're not even forced to move from room to room in middle school, of the physical presence of being there. I think it's been a real challenge to bring the joy through the screen, right? To bring that energy of being together in community. So I think the long-lasting effects of this is that these students that are going to come back to school eventually, hopefully sooner rather than later, is this idea of what school is and what learning is, and to re-engage students in that social emotional aspect of school that they're going to be so long without.
It's so interesting, just to think about the skills, as you say, other than academic skills that are taught in ways that are informal that we don't even think about through those sorts of physical interactions.
And if I was to just add possibly a more positive sort of ending to this conversation, this part of our conversation, I would say that, some of the early findings from special education research suggests that parents have actually, because now parents are certainly stressed. Parents or kids with special needs are, even more so in many cases, have the same stressors that other parents have about their children's well-being, their health. Everything that everyone else is negotiating right now is happening for that population. But this opportunity seems to have arisen through this process, whereby parents have had sort of a front seat for their children's learning in many cases. This is also difficult for so many of our parents who don't have those opportunities or have difficulties with connecting through remote learning for their students. But for others, the opportunity to really engage with teachers and to sort of become part of their students' learning process has been a positive. So I'm just sort of putting out there this idea that, some of the lessons we're going to learn through this process could carry over into a post-pandemic period, and sort of maybe we can sort of carry with us some of the positives that we have learned.
I very much appreciate that. And just to go off of that point, I was thinking about the sort of skills that students might actually be gaining through remote learning. So obviously, with remote learning, you're taking turns in a different way if there's a group discussion and things like that. Is that possible that there might be even some technology skills that could be gained?
Absolutely. And I would also say, because those of us who are interested in sort of coping strategies, right, we oftentimes recommend little bits of challenge to be okay for our students, right? We want those opportunities to sort of problem solve and sort of cope with those new challenges. This context is new for so many students, so they have to learn new methods of communicating with their peers and teachers, new ways to self-advocate for their needs. When something doesn't go as they expected in that Zoom session, what's the next, strategy for this student? And so it is a new situation, but opportunity is there as well to sort of learn new strategies.
No, that you really don't build those skills unless necessity is there. And so that makes a lot of sense.
Absolutely.
Yeah. No, to sort of transition to another topic, I have a few questions related to how to support and nurture children's social and mental health. And we got a lot of questions from audience members, actually, when they were registering, so related to that topic. One of them is about preventive strategies. So even pre-COVID, what are the sorts of things that we do to help children regulate emotions and manage emotions, especially different types of negative emotions?
I think that's a critical question, and I think if we can learn from what we've done in the past that's been successful and that we want to continue now, is the importance of children knowing what's coming. So, expectations, routines, keeping things predictable, understanding their role in what that is, their expectations, what we expect of children to do, and how adults are going to engage with them. So I think one of the things that we can do to help prevent any additional concerns because of this, and just, good life skills, is to consider how we can maintain as much consistency as possible for these children. We talk a lot about kind of continuing what was there before now. It might look different, but if we can maintain connections with peers, which again is harder for the younger kids, but if we can maintain some, semblance of interactions with children socially, with their families, things like exercise in whatever capacity they're able to do at home, things like that can again replicate some of the experiences they were having in school and with their friends outside, that they'll be able to do now in the same exact way, in slightly different way, but in a similar essence, is going to be helpful in kind of preventing some of these larger concerns and coming up.
I think of going off of that is I always recommend with families to talk about feelings and emotions regularly so that it's a normal part of conversation, kind of what you're saying about routines and keeping up with that. Like in school, we use Yale's ruler model. And so we use the mood meter, right, where kids are checking in and letting us know how they feel at different times of the day. And just to be able to name that for the younger students is very important. But for our older students to really check in where students are feeling and being able to work with that and to see how it changes and how they're able to use those coping skills. But I think the more that we make it part of our life in school and at home to talk about feelings and emotions and making it a normal part of our day makes it easier so that when those big emotions come up or the more difficult or challenging ones, that we're able to talk about what those are and then create those next steps through coping skills.
No, thanks. And I'm not sure, Dr. Jeromey, if you might be able to speak to either of those sorts of things, how they might look different for children with developmental disabilities. Like I'm thinking about for routines, different types of visual schedules, other sorts of things. Probably.
Yeah, I mean, it's largely the same, right? But it's adjusted potentially. Some of this content might be adjusted so that it's more accessible to students with special needs, depending on their level of development and their level of support needs. Talking about emotions is equally important for this population. Parents talking about their own emotions, right? And we all have those emotions right now, and acknowledging that. In fact, in some ways, students, parents have said to me that their children can now sort of empathize with them about all of the stressors that they have with their, the amount of time that we spend online and with our computers, our remote teaching of our own. We sort of have this now shared understanding of we're sort of all getting through this together. But you absolutely agree that parents should be, using those emotion words, breaking it down, offering really concrete examples for students who might not have, who are younger or who need a little bit more support in understanding those concepts, applying them more readily to those students' experiences so they can really sort of understand their own feelings as well as others' feelings. But we really just sort of adapt a lot of the same material that we would want to use for a general education population for our students with special needs.
That makes sense. It might look a bit different, but or across the developmental course, or for individuals with developmental disabilities. So no, thanks very much to all of you for that. So these were preventive strategies. One of the questions that we always get, very important question as mental health providers in particular, when can you tell that there might be something that's a problem, that's not just a normal reaction to a stressor? And so what are the signs that a student is having just an atypical adjustment, an atypically difficult time adjusting to this?
I think one of the best way to answer that is to think developmentally. So that reaction or that response, that signal that they're giving you is going to look really different depending on the age of the child. For instance, and maybe I'll speak to the younger children and some other people can speak to some of the older school age kids. But if you're thinking a little bit about young children, preschool age children, some of these anxieties that are coming out may look like increased temper tantrums, increased clinginess, different types of behavior that's coming out of nowhere, but that we still need to recognize might be linked to some of these other issues. So they may demonstrate it in those particular way. Other types of kids, especially when they're older, may be engaging, other than communicating some of these areas of stress, maybe kind of demonstrating that they're not as interested in things like school or wanting to engage in alternative ways of meeting up with friends or peers or things like that. Sarah, I'm not sure if you want to add to that.
Sure. I mean, I think of our middle school students, it's the same, but a little bit different, right? We see students that are usually very academically successful, withdrawing from their learning, those, withdrawn behaviors or, not wanting to socialize as usual. But we also see the other behaviors like having higher anxiety around things or feeling worry or concern. So I think on both sides of the spectrum. But I think what's really interesting is, as none of us have been through a global pandemic before, we're all kind of figuring out what baseline really means. And when you work with individual students, it's really figuring out what their new baseline is in the middle of the pandemic and realizing, some of these things may be stressors that are reactive to this time, but it also could be something even more escalated. So I think it's kind of being malleable and changing and meeting your students where they're at to see exactly what they may need. And sometimes it's just opening that line of communication and kind of speaking to what Dr. Jeromey was saying before about maintaining that authenticity with students.
Mm-hmm. No, that's great. I appreciate those answers. And I think probably a good way to finish up the general panel before we go to Q&A is, if a child is having a reaction that's not typical, what are the things that a parent can and should be doing at that point if there's concern that there might be a psychological problem?
So it seems like we're going in order. I always encourage parents to think about filling 3 different pots: the biological, the psychological, and the social, right? So I try to think about, we often, when things are chaotic, think about making sure that we're meeting their biological needs, food, shelter, etc. And obviously, especially as they get older, we're thinking about things like friendships. But when we start seeing things get bad, we kind of want to assess that scenario and think, how are they doing in all these particular areas? Things can slip away rather quickly, and over time, we're seeing, like Sarah was saying, some changes in people, and not really knowing what the new normal is. So wanting to kind of go back to that and say, how are they doing socially? Can I think of ways of encouraging that social, filling up that social bucket in novel ways, obviously, that are permittable, and also things like filling up their psychological bucket. So can we do things like have increased family time? Can we engage in exercise in different ways? Other things that we know that are going to improve children's mood and maybe they might not be engaging in. So I try to have people kind of go back to the basics and think about, are they fulfilling their needs in those 3 areas? And what can parents do to kind of help support children getting back on track in those regards?
Oh, that's a great rule of thumb. That's really easy to, I think.
I think in a school setting, it's really interesting that sometimes our knee-jerk reaction is to call the parent and see what's going on when we see a behavior in a child, right? And I always recommend to really go to the child first. And I think it's really talking about things we've already discussed, having those authentic conversations with students, sharing with them as adults how we're feeling, whether it's in the school setting or at home, about how this is difficult for us, and normalizing what this all is like and feels like. And then also really trying to have an honest conversation with them of how things are feeling for them and how it's different and how it's new and how it's very difficult. And I think from there, you know, when you're able to really connect with a child about what's going on with them, to really problem solve in partnership and together with them to make them feel part of the solution. And I think even in that in itself will allow for kids to feel better and lighter about what's going on.
No, thank you. It's a really key point to actually go and have a conversation with a child. It's surprising how often we get referrals as mental health providers where there hasn't really been a great deal of conversation between a parent and a child about that. So I appreciate that. So looking at the time, what I'm actually going to do is transition to our Q&A session. So please continue to submit your questions in the chat, but we also have a few that were submitted earlier that we're going to begin with as well that haven't been discussed before. Let's see. Okay, so this is a conglomerate of questions that I sort of put into a scenario. We got a number of questions on this topic about children who don't have the same motivation specific for doing schoolwork and both classwork and homework, things like that, that they did before COVID. So how can parents increase that motivation without applying so much pressure that there are concerns about emotional health?
So this is a big one with my middle schoolers, but definitely school-wide. And we've talked, you know, about creating school structures for this. But at home, I think it's really that balance of what that question asks is, how can we talk to our students about the need to do work and complete work while it's also difficult during this time? And I think as adults in our own careers, we can find that difficult as well. So I think it's really breaking things down within the structures that exist for them. So really looking at what sets them up for success, whether it's their learning environment or their schedule and keeping that routine, to breaking down goals and chunking them into smaller pieces to support them, to motivate them, and then also to create those spaces for balance. I always talk to my middle school kids about how, you know, I even have to trick myself sometimes into like, you know, you get to do that fun thing after you do an hour of work, or you get a treat, you know, the small little things that we do for ourselves that really can apply to kids, but also to give that balance of, you know, a screen break, a work break, and to really infuse those into their routine so that it doesn't seem like it's Zoom after Zoom or Google Classroom work unlimited.
I absolutely, oh, please go.
It's okay, Dr. Arora, I can wait. You can go first.
I absolutely agree with that. I was going to say two things. I mean, we have to recognize that that this is, as Sarah was saying, this is a pandemic. I mean, we have to shift our expectations a little bit of what is typical. So I think parents coming to understand that what is a good amount of success right now might look different than what was a good amount of success a year ago. I think the other thing to think about is extrinsic motivation. So, you know, we think about giving rewards for things that kids need help doing. Previously, they might not have had any problems with this, but right now they might start needing more of that. And it's okay to take different strategies. So if we need to kind of step up and give them some motivation from those other sources that for things that they might not have had problems doing before, I think right now it's okay. I think understanding that the context changes, that the kids are going to be able to change along with that is part of the process.
Thanks.
The only thing I was going to add is to really emphasize the separation of our, you know, different contexts in a home environment and similar to what we do in the school environment, right? So making sure that there is a very finite time that we are in remote learning, and that's obviously going to be somewhat governed by school hours, and then having a clear separation from that so that, you know, this exhaustion and this lack of motivation and this sort of, you know, disinclination to be sitting in front of a screen doesn't sort of spill over into, you know, other types of activities, sort of making sure that we are making that schedule and sort of conform, you know, adjusting our lives around that schedule.
It's so interesting because, you know, for many of us who are working remotely as adults, we know that it's much easier for work to spill over into non-work hours because we're in the same setting for both. And I don't know how many of us have considered that children are in the same situation where it might be easier for them to take on too much or feel as though they're always working. And then there's even a decrease of motivation for social activities and things beyond that, because it feels the same on Zoom, whether or not you're in class or with friends. So it's
right. Social activities look a lot like school activities when you're in a remote context, right?
It's so important. It's hard to distinguish. So we're actually going to transition to the questions that have been asked on YouTube. So one, when a child is really falling apart, how should a parent advocate on the child's behalf to tell the teacher in school? So really in terms of what the process is, what the logistics should be, if there's a need in the parent's view for a type of accommodation that the child not complete assignments or something like that.
So I could speak directly at our school. I think communication is always helpful. So I think there's never too soon to communicate with a teacher to let them know how things are going, especially before it's a fall apart, right? If you just are noticing that your child's struggling or falling behind, starting that communication early can always be helpful. But if it is at that escalated level, I think the first part is to open up that line of communication and advocate on your child's behalf. I think with our older students, we also are trying to develop those self-advocacy skills so that when they're realizing that they're behind or struggling, to have them communicate. And I think part of that beauty of technology is, students that we have that are less likely to talk to their teachers, right? To put in a Zoom chat or to write on a Google Classroom or to write an email is a little bit easier for some of our students, and it's giving that further access to them. But I always think communication is really helpful. And I think at this time, a lot of our teachers are very flexible. Even the DOE themselves is being more flexible and extending terms, giving more time for students to make up work. So I think there is a lot of flexibility. So I would really encourage as much communication as possible.
It sounds like it's important to keep in mind that families and parents and children themselves shouldn't be embarrassed to bring up these sorts of things. The folks who you're talking to, teachers, are going to be more understanding and probably can empathize very much themselves with those sorts of issues. So, absolutely. Yeah. And how should parents react when kids said school was bad again? So I know we've heard a lot of concerns over the quality and way in which school is being done, which is, as hard for schools and teachers at the moment as it is for children. And so how to respond to those sorts of issues.
My own students sometimes will tell me that my own lesson was bad. That was boring, Ms. Feeney, or, that wasn't very good. And I welcome them into the conversation of giving me that feedback of how could we improve? And I spoke to it earlier, like how do we bring that joy back? So I think, at home, having that conversation of what was bad about it? What do you miss about school? Rather than just this, cycle of it's bad every day, of how can we bring them in to consider how they could improve their learning or what would make it fun for them? And I think, again, communicating that with teachers could only be helpful.
I agree. And I would add that I think parents just being able to hear some of that without trying to fix it might be okay. I think right now, some of us just need to be able to say, this is hard. And a child saying this is hard to a parent or that wasn't fun, I think, to just hear it out and say, it sounds like that wasn't a fun day. It sounds like you had a hard day. What can we do now to make it something better? So I often tell people too, to think about one successful thing that they can do outside of school every day, either as a family or on their own, that they can make their day better. There's just so much pressure right now and so many additional challenges that it's okay to have a challenging day, but also to kind of use this as an opportunity to think about how to make ourselves feel better when we can't fix the problem.
Oh, thanks. I appreciate it. Let's see. Another question from YouTube. How do you help students who are unable to engage in online or asynchronous learning? So this may be a especially good question about individual differences in learners.
I think that generally speaking, for all of our learners, we need to sort of identify where those challenges are. Does it have to do with attention? Is it something that has to do with sort of understanding, comprehension of what's going on in the classroom? Is there something else going on that is sort of inhibiting the student from getting engaged? Some students might feel anxious about having their video front and center on their, on their and their peers' computers every day. And so they might sort of be inclined to sort of, scale back their engagement. Other students might find it, difficult to contribute to that chat because they just don't know what to write in that moment when everyone else is sort of chiming in. Sort of identifying where those challenges are to really help you as a parent, and I think as someone who's going to communicate some of these challenges to a teacher or a counselor, to sort of identify where we can start to support students who are having those difficulties.
It's important to keep in mind that there are a variety of places at which, someone would have trouble with remote learning. And so the solution will really depend on a lot of the details and the mechanism there. Let's see. We've had many questions about Zoom burnout, but this is a great question specifically about students who have attention issues, hyperactivity, those sorts of problems.
Yeah, I don't know any data that has necessarily identified differences with respect to that Zoom burnout. In fact, I would maybe turn it back over to you, Dr. Lovett, given that this is your expertise. Are there perhaps findings that suggest that the COVID experience has been experienced differently by such students?
There are. So there have just been a couple of studies published very recently, one I think in the Journal of Adolescent Health, that have just come out on remote learning and students with ADHD in the time of COVID. And what I always try to explain is that ADHD is generally a deficit in what we call executive functioning, being able to plan and regulate yourself, organize, all those sorts of things. And we're all having executive function challenges during COVID. We all are experiencing what it's like to not be able to plan because we don't know what things are going to be like, and to lack the sort of stamina that we used to have to be able to do that sort of work. So for students with ADHD, it certainly is exacerbated. The specific deficit that's relevant to Zoom fatigue is sustained attention, being able to focus and stay with something for a long period of time. We know that students with ADHD are going to have that issue with regard to anything that's not a chosen activity that involves frequent reinforcement. Video games, very different. But something that is a more typical academic activity, we know there are going to be more challenges. So we talk about things like the need for frequent breaks. We talk about the sorts of things like being able to use reward systems for being able to do something at the end of whatever that period is. If you're going to be able to focus on class because there's an activity, even asking your child what happened and what was learned and what was covered and what happened in class is the sort of thing where you're more engaged, you're paying attention for some reason. So just to briefly describe some of those things.
And if I may say, all of those strategies would be so helpful for absolutely anybody right now that's having to experience Zoom fatigue and other sorts of overuse.
Yeah, absolutely. For grown-ups too. It's with or without ADHD. So absolutely. So I appreciate the questions from the audience. We have another question. What do you hope schools will take away from this experience, especially with regard to issues of inequality going forward? And what identified problems should become next steps? So.
What a great question. I would, for the first part of that question, I think what we've learned is even more so than we knew before about the critical roles schools play in addressing inequalities. That schools are really there meeting the needs of all children beyond just education, and really all the precursors to education. So I think recognizing and honoring the roles schools have in that regard, even more so moving forward, and addressing, or rather complementing that with resulting areas of support. So thinking about how we can better support schools in meeting these needs, connecting with our most underserved youth in the way that they have previously, but even having to do more so in the future. I think recognizing that and putting actionable steps in place so that the schools have the supports that they need in order to be able to do that is one of our first steps. Thinking about how to have additional time for school mental health providers to be able to contact or connect with people that were historically less connected with schools in order to facilitate the kind of communication that's needed and the kind of relationships that are needed, especially during this particular time and moving forward from this, are going to be key.
Oh, thanks very much. So we're out of time for questions from the audience, but I just want to conclude, we're almost out of time for the event. I want to conclude with a question for the panel about this issue of resilience, as it's often called. So what can we do to encourage children? A lot of this has come up in your responses already, but what are the sorts of things that we can do to support children being able to bounce back from this, perhaps gain additional skills, and more generally, not have negative outcomes from stressful events like this? Mm-hmm.
Very quickly, I always think about the analogy of on the airplane with the oxygen mask. I think what we need to do as educators, parents, other professionals working with kids is to make sure that we model taking care of ourselves first. So we need to think about how we can show them how a person who's facing challenges can overcome these things. They obviously have the capacity to do so, and how can we model how we do that as well? I think showing that challenges are a normal part of our existence and that we can face them and overcome them using certain strategies, and that it's okay to discuss those and it's okay to fail along the process is how we're going to be, is how we're going to best support their own development of resilience.
I agree. I think that first and foremost, we have to sort of encourage parents, educators, service providers to not strive for perfection and to appreciate their own, their own resilience and their own needs, and to sort of acknowledge that self-care and sort of, putting their own needs, prioritizing their own needs is also an important part of this process. The other thing I often think of is how, we need to make sure, I would like to recommend to the parents and the educators and the service providers out there that they really appreciate how resilient children are. I always think of, whenever I hear resilience, I think of Anne Maston, who is this scholar, this sort of, leading scholar of the work on resilience. And she uses a term called ordinary magic to refer to those processes or those capacities that children, develop that serve the needs that they have for resilience when faced with challenge. And this is one of those situations. So, everything that parents and teachers and service providers are already doing to sort of support children's feelings of, attachment to their adults, their loved ones, their sense of self-regulation, their, feelings of connection with their parents and families and friends. Those are the sort of building blocks of resilience. And so everything we're already doing and we already advocate for is really what's going to serve our children and our students. So I think that's a sort of a positive. It's important to take this positive sort of perspective and not sort of overemphasize the deficits that we're sort of concerned about, because really children are rather resilient.
I think this time also really underlines the importance of checking in with ourselves and checking with each other, and also with whatever we're faced with every day, to have those little wins. And academically, I see that with a lot of our students, that student that usually feels out of control by the classroom social environment now at home feels more in control and independent, or the student that worries about, the well-being of their family, that is able to be at home and feel like they can be around their family and make sure that they're okay while also learning. And those students that are more quiet or shy, that have that opportunity to put in the chat or communicate, non-verbally, it allows them to shine. So I think there's little wins everywhere, kind of that ordinary magic that you're speaking to, and that we really have to see those at this time as, strong step forwards of our students and the families that support them.
Oh, these are great practical tips and a way of reframing our own experiences every day, because it's easy to feel as though things are overwhelming and there are a lot of challenges at the moment. But part of that is understanding that we can't behave the way we used to, and we can't have the same expectations for ourselves or for our children. So, thank you very much. We're actually out of time for tonight, but I want to thank first is the panelists for sharing their expertise with us and with the community. And thank you all for attending the event and for your questions. Be well, stay well during this difficult period, and have a good evening.